From the frozen black metal forests of Norway to the hip-hop studios of Queens, from punk basements to reggae mansions, bandmates and associates have become executioners. We are investigating the 10 most terrifying cases where music legends were silenced not by strangers, but by people who knew their home addresses and their schedules. Number 1. Euronymous. In the frost-bitten suburbs of Oslo, Norway, there exists a music scene that was never meant to stay within the boundaries of entertainment. It was called black metal. In the early 1990s, this was not simply a genre of fast guitars and shrieking vocals. It was a death cult with album covers instead of pamphlets. The musicians who created it did not want fans. They wanted disciples. And the price of admission to their inner circle would sometimes be measured in blood. At the dark heart of this movement stood a band called Mayhem. They were not interested in record sales or mainstream recognition. They wanted to create the most extreme, the most disturbing, and the most genuinely evil music ever recorded. Their founder and lead guitarist was a young man named Øystein Arseth. He performed under the name Euronymous. He ran a small record shop in Oslo called Helvete, which translates to hell in Norwegian. The basement of that store became the meeting place for a circle of young men who called themselves the Black Circle. They burned churches, they worshipped darkness, and they would eventually turn on each other with lethal consequences. To understand the murder of Euronymous, you first have to understand what happened to Mayhem before he died. In April 1991, the band's Swedish vocalist, Per Yngve Olin, known by his stage name Dead, committed suicide with a shotgun in a house the band shared outside Oslo. Dead had struggled with severe mental illness for years. He had once buried his stage clothes in the ground and dug them up weeks later so they would smell like decay. He cut himself during performances until blood ran down his arms. He was fascinated by mortality in ways that went far beyond theatrical performance. When Euronymous discovered Dead's body, he did not immediately call the police. Instead, according to accounts that would later become legendary in the metal underground, he went to a nearby store and purchased a disposable camera. He returned to the scene and took photographs of his dead bandmate. He allegedly rearranged pieces of the skull for better composition. One of those photographs would later appear on a bootleg album cover. An image so disturbing it remains controversial to this day. Rumors spread that Euronymous collected fragments of Dead's skull and fashioned them into necklaces. He reportedly distributed these grim artifacts to musicians he considered worthy of the Black Circle. Whether all of these stories were true or embellished over decades of retelling, they established Euronymous as a figure who treated death as currency and mythology as fuel. He was building something more than a band. He was building a cult, and he did not seem to care who had to suffer for his vision. Into this poisoned world came a young musician from Bergen named Christian Vikernes. He would later become infamous under the name Varg. Varg was the sole member of a one-man project called Burzum. His music was raw, atmospheric, and hypnotic. His ideology was a toxic mixture of Norse paganism and white supremacist beliefs. Euronymous saw potential in Varg. He invited him into the Black Circle. He asked him to play bass on Mayhem's upcoming album, a record that would be titled De Mysteriis Dom Satanas. For a brief and volatile moment, they were collaborators working toward a common darkness. But the alliance between Euronymous and Varg was poisoned from its very beginning. Both men possessed enormous egos. Both believed they were the rightful leader of the Norwegian black metal scene. Both were willing to do terrible things to prove their commitment to darkness. And beneath the surface, they had a fundamental ideological split that would eventually prove fatal. Euronymous identified as a Satanist. He saw Satan as a symbol of rebellion and individual power. Varg rejected Satanism entirely. He viewed it as just another Abrahamic construct, a foreign religion with roots in the Middle East that had no place in the Nordic soul. Varg worshipped the Old Norse gods. He believed in a coming racial war that would cleanse Europe. He saw himself as a warrior for an ancient bloodline. These ideological differences festered between them like an infected wound. The rivalry escalated into something far more dangerous than musical competition. Between 1992 and 1993, A wave of church burnings swept across Norway. Ancient wooden stave churches, some dating back to the medieval period, were reduced to ash and rubble. At least 50 churches were burned or vandalized during this period. Varg was eventually convicted of burning 3 of them. He described these arsons as acts of war against Christianity, a religion he believed had been violently imposed on his Viking ancestors. Euronymous was rumored to have involvement in the church burnings as well, though his direct participation was never proven in court. What is certain is that both men were playing an escalating game of extremity. Each wanted to prove he was more dangerous than the other. Each wanted to claim the throne of Norwegian black metal. The scene they had built together was becoming a pressure cooker, and rumors began to circulate through the underground that Euronymous was planning something truly monstrous. According to Varg's later testimony, Euronymous had developed detailed plans to kidnap him. Varg claimed that Euronymous intended to take him to an isolated cabin in the Norwegian wilderness. He would be tortured with a stun gun while the assault was filmed on video, and then he would be killed. Varg stated that he learned of these plans through trusted contacts within the Black Circle. He claimed that Euronymous had actually signed a written contract detailing the murder plot. Whether this contract ever existed remains a subject of fierce debate among those who study the case. No physical evidence of such a document has ever been produced. But Varg believed the threat was absolutely real. He decided that he would not wait to become a victim. He would strike first and eliminate the threat before it could be carried out. On the night of August 10th, 1993, Varg drove from Bergen to Oslo with a companion named Snorre Rook, the guitarist of the band Thorns. They arrived at Euronymous' apartment building in the early morning hours, somewhere around 3 a.m. The building was quiet. Most residents were asleep. What happened next depends entirely on whose account you choose to believe. Varg has always maintained that he went to the apartment to talk. He claims that Euronymous attacked him first, perhaps realizing that his murder plot had been discovered. Varg says the killing was self-defense, a fight that spiraled beyond control in the cramped stairwell of a residential building. He has told this story consistently for 3 decades. The physical evidence told a very different story to investigators. Euronymous was found dead in the stairwell of his apartment building. He had been stabbed 23 times. 2 of those wounds were delivered to his head. The others were distributed across his face, his neck, and his back. Forensic analysis revealed that some of the wounds were clearly defensive in nature. Euronymous had raised his hands to protect himself. He had fought desperately for his life. But other wounds told a darker story. Several stab wounds had been delivered to Euronymous' back. This suggested he had been attacked from behind, possibly while trying to flee up the stairs to safety. A man defending himself does not typically have the opportunity to stab his attacker repeatedly in the back. The pattern of wounds suggested not a chaotic fight, but a sustained and relentless assault. The police found Euronymous' body the following morning. He was lying in the stairwell wearing only his underwear. He had been left where he fell. Within days, investigators had traced the crime back to Varg Vikernes. He was arrested along with several other members of the Black Circle. The Norwegian media erupted with coverage that dominated headlines for weeks. The nation was horrified to learn about the satanic underground that had been growing in their midst. At trial, Varg did not deny that he had killed Euronymous. He denied that it constituted murder. He maintained his self-defense narrative with absolute conviction. He argued that he had no choice but to kill a man who was actively planning to torture and murder him. The prosecution argued that Varg had driven hours in the middle of the night specifically to commit a premeditated killing. The jury did not believe Varg's account. On May 16, 1994, Christian Vikernes was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison, the maximum sentence available under Norwegian law. He was also convicted on 4 separate counts of arson for the church burnings. The sentence was delivered in a courtroom filled with cameras and reporters. Varg reportedly smiled when the verdict was announced. He was 21 years old. He would spend the next 15 years behind bars before being released on parole in 2009. In the decades since his release, Varg has continued to make music under the Burzum name. He has also continued to espouse his extremist ideological views. He has never expressed remorse for the killing. Perhaps the strangest postscript to this murder involves the album that first brought Varg and Euronymous together. De Mysteriis Dom Sathanas was finally released in May 1994. The same month, Varg was convicted of murder. The album features Varg's bass playing alongside the guitar work of the man he killed. Euronymous' family reportedly asked the record label to remove Varg's bass tracks from the final mix. The label refused. The killer and his victim remain bonded together on that recording forever. You can still purchase it today. This case forces us to confront terrifying questions about the boundaries between art and ideology, between performance and genuine evil. Euronymous built a mythology of death, exploiting the suicide of his own vocalist for underground credibility. Varg believed in an ideology so extreme that it justified murder in his own mind. Both men created the conditions for their shared tragedy. Do you believe Varg acted in genuine self-defense against a real threat? Or was this a premeditated execution dressed up as survival? Was Euronymous a mastermind of darkness, or just a young man playing a dangerous role he never understood could cost him his life? I want to hear your thoughts on the deadliest rivalry in metal history in the comments below. If this chilling story of ideology turned lethal left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video with anyone who follows extreme music, and make sure you are subscribed for our second case, where we travel from the frozen forests of Norway to the elegant high-rises of Manhattan, where a classic rock legend was killed by the woman who wrote his most famous lyrics. Number 2. Felix Papalardi. In the upscale east side of Manhattan, in an elegant high-rise apartment that overlooked the sprawling city, there lived one of the most respected ears in rock and roll history. His name was Felix Papalardi. He was not a household name to casual music fans, but within the industry, he was a titan. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, he had produced some of the most influential albums ever recorded. He was the man behind the console for Cream's legendary Disraeli Gears, the record that helped define blues rock for an entire generation. Felix had an ear for greatness. He knew how to coax brilliance from musicians and translate raw energy into polished recordings. Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker trusted him with their sound during the height of their creative powers. The work he did with Cream established him as one of the premier producers of his era. He could have spent the rest of his career behind the glass, shaping the sounds of other artists. But Felix Papalardi was not content to remain in the shadows. In 1969, he stepped out from behind the console and co-founded his own band. He called it Mountain. The group was built around the massive, thunderous guitar work of Leslie West, a New York musician whose sound was as large as his physical presence. Felix played bass and contributed his production expertise to every recording. Their chemistry was immediate and powerful. Mountain's breakthrough came with a song called Mississippi Queen. The track was a hard-driving slice of blues rock that became an instant classic. It still plays on classic rock radio stations today, more than 5 decades after its release. Felix was living the dream that every studio musician secretly harbors. He had stepped from the control room onto the stage. He had become a star in his own right. To understand the tragedy that would end Felix Papalardi's life, you must first understand his marriage. His wife was a woman named Gail Collins. She was not a silent partner who stayed home while her husband toured. She was his closest creative collaborator for well over a decade. Gail wrote the lyrics for many of Mountain's biggest songs, including the words to Mississippi Queen. She designed their album covers. She was present at every recording session, offering opinions on arrangements and mixes. In the male-dominated music industry of the 1970s, this kind of partnership was genuinely rare. Gail was not merely the wife of a rock star. She received writing credits on albums. She had real creative control. She and Felix presented themselves to the world as an inseparable team. Friends described their relationship as symbiotic. It was difficult to tell where Felix's vision ended and Gail's began. For years, this arrangement appeared to work. They created music together. They built a career together. They shared everything. But beneath the polished surface of that creative partnership, something dark was festering. The marriage was increasingly troubled by jealousy and suspicion. Rumors circulated within their social circle that Felix had been unfaithful. Gail reportedly suspected him of conducting affairs with other women. The creative collaboration that had once bonded them began to feel less like partnership and more like surveillance. She was always there, always watching, always present. By the early 1980s, Felix Papalardi was no longer the titan he had been in the previous decade. His hearing had been severely damaged by years of working in loud studios and playing louder concerts. Producing music at the level he had once achieved was becoming increasingly difficult. The band Mountain had broken up and reunited multiple times, each iteration less successful than the last. At 43 years old, Felix was a man grappling with fading health, a deteriorating marriage, and a career that existed primarily in the past tense. On the morning of April 17, 1983, Felix Papalardi was shot in the neck inside his own apartment. The bullet came from a .32 caliber Derringer, a small pistol that Gail kept in their home. The shooter was Gail Collins herself. She was holding the weapon when it discharged. She called the police immediately after the shot was fired. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found Felix dead in the bedroom. The wound was catastrophic. A single bullet fired at close range had torn through his neck and severed major blood vessels. There was no possibility of survival. Gail was present and cooperating with officers. She provided her account of the events without hesitation. According to Gail Collins, she had been showing Felix the Derringer. It was a small, antique-style pistol that she kept for personal protection. She claimed the gun discharged accidentally while she was demonstrating how it worked. She insisted she had never intended any harm to the man she had spent 17 years beside. It was a tragedy, she told investigators. A horrible accident that happened in a single, irreversible moment. Nothing more sinister than that. The prosecutors who reviewed the case did not find her story credible. They charged Gail Collins with second-degree murder. The prosecution argued that the shooting was intentional, the violent culmination of years of jealousy and resentment that had finally boiled over. They pointed to the couple's troubled marriage as evidence of motive. They highlighted the rumors of infidelity that had plagued the relationship for years. They argued that Gail Collins had killed her husband in a moment of jealous rage. The trial became a media sensation within the music industry. Here was the widow of a rock legend, the woman who had co-written his biggest hits and designed his album art, standing accused of his murder. The courtroom was packed with journalists covering every detail. The testimony that emerged painted a picture of a marriage poisoned by suspicion, control, and deteriorating trust. Defense attorneys argued that Gail Collins had no motive to kill her husband. They emphasized her role as his creative partner. They suggested that the shooting was exactly what she claimed it to be: a tragic accident involving an unfamiliar weapon. They asked the jury to consider whether a woman who had devoted her entire adult life to a man would suddenly decide to end his life. The jury deliberated and reached a compromise verdict that satisfied almost no one. They found Gail Collins guilty of criminally negligent homicide rather than murder. The jury apparently believed she had caused Felix's death through reckless handling of the firearm. But they were not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that she had formed the specific intent to kill him. It was a verdict that acknowledged wrongdoing while stopping short of labeling the act as murder. The sentence that followed sparked outrage that persists to this day. For taking the life of Felix Papalardi, Gail Collins was sentenced to 4 years in prison. With good behavior and parole considerations, she served only 2 years before being released. 24 months for ending the life of one of rock's most respected producers. Leslie West never accepted the verdict. The guitarist who had built Mountain alongside Felix believed until his own death in 2020 that Gail had murdered his bandmate and closest friend. He spoke about it in interviews for decades. He described the shooting as deliberate. He felt that Gail had gotten away with murder in plain sight, protected by a sympathetic jury that could not imagine a creative collaborator turning killer. After her release from prison, Gail Collins retreated from public life almost entirely. She lived quietly in Mexico for many years, far from the New York music scene where she had once been a significant presence. She occasionally gave interviews to journalists who tracked her down. In those rare conversations, She continued to maintain her innocence. She insisted that the gun had discharged accidentally. She claimed that Felix's death was a tragedy she had never intended and would regret for the remainder of her days. Gail Collins died in 2013, 30 years after the shooting. She never changed her story. She never confessed to intentional killing. She took whatever truth existed about that April morning to her grave. This case presents us with impossible questions about truth, memory, and survival. There was a gun, a bedroom, a 17-year marriage, and only one survivor left to tell the story. The physical evidence could support either interpretation, an accidental discharge, or a deliberate execution at close range would produce similar forensic results with a small caliber weapon. Do you believe that a woman who spent over a decade handling studio equipment and traveling through a dangerous music industry would not know how to safely handle a small pistol? Do you believe a gun simply discharges in trained hands without the trigger being deliberately pulled? Or do you believe this was justice denied, a murder disguised as accident in a city where money and fame can purchase reasonable doubt? I want to hear your thoughts on whether Gail Collins was guilty or simply devastatingly unlucky in the comments below. If this haunting story of creative partnership turned deadly left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video with anyone who follows classic rock history, and make sure you are subscribed for our third case, where we travel from Manhattan to the hills above Kingston, Jamaica, where a reggae legend was murdered in his own home by a man he had once called a brother. Number 3. Peter Tosh. In the hills above Kingston, Jamaica, there stands a legacy that towers over the entire history of reggae music. It is the legacy of the original Wailers, the group that brought Jamaican music to the world stage and transformed Bob Marley into a global icon. But Marley was not the only giant who emerged from that revolutionary band. Standing beside him in those early years was a man equally talented, equally visionary, and far more confrontational. His name was Peter Tosh. Peter Tosh was not a man who smiled for cameras or softened his message for international audiences. He was militant. He was uncompromising. He wrote songs that demanded legalization of marijuana when such advocacy could land you in prison. He wrote songs about equal rights when speaking about equality could get you beaten by authorities. His nickname was the Steppin' Razor, taken from a song that warned anyone who crossed him that he was dangerous, that he would cut you without hesitation. After leaving the Wailers in 1974, Peter Tosh built a solo career that established him as a reggae legend in his own right. His album Legalize It became an anthem for the marijuana legalization movement worldwide. His song Equal Rights was adopted by human rights activists across the globe. He won a Grammy Award in 1987 for the album No Nuclear War. He was not living in Bob Marley's shadow. He had carved out his own space in the sun. But Jamaica in the 1980s was a dangerous place for anyone with wealth and fame. The island was plagued by gang violence, political instability, and a culture where robbery often escalated to murder. Even legends were not safe in their own homes. To understand the death of Peter Tosh, you must understand the man who killed him. His name was Dennis Laban, though he was known on the streets of Kingston by his nickname, Lepo. Dennis Laban was not a stranger to Peter Tosh. He was a man from Tosh's past, someone the reggae star had known for years. When Laban was released from prison after serving time for robbery, Tosh reportedly helped him. He gave Laban money. He tried to assist in his reintegration into society. It was an act of generosity that would prove fatal. But Laban was not grateful. He was hungry. He saw in Tosh not a friend who had helped him, but a wealthy target who had more than he was willing to share. Laban began demanding money with increasing frequency and aggression. He felt entitled to Tosh's success. When Tosh refused his escalating demands, Laban's resentment curdled into something murderous. On the evening of September 11th, 1987, Peter Tosh was at home in his residence in the Stockard, Andrew Parish of Jamaica. He was not alone. Several friends and associates had gathered at the house that night, including his common-law wife, Marlene Brown. The atmosphere was relaxed. There was no indication that the evening would end in bloodshed. At approximately 8:30 p.m., Dennis Laban arrived at the property. He was not alone. Two accomplices accompanied him. They were armed. They forced their way into the house and immediately took control of the situation through terror and firepower. What began as an apparent robbery quickly revealed itself as something more targeted. Laban demanded money. But even as he made demands, witnesses later recalled that his attention remained focused on Peter Tosh. This was not a random home invasion. This was personal. Laban had come for Tosh specifically. The robbery was a cover for an execution. When the violence erupted, it was swift and devastating. Laban shot Peter Tosh in the head at close range. The wound was immediately fatal. The Stepan Razor, the man who had warned the world that he was dangerous, was killed in his own living room by someone he had tried to help. But Laban did not stop with Tosh. Two other people in the house that night were also killed. Jeff Dixon, a disc jockey, was shot dead. Wilton Brown, a friend of Tosh's, was also murdered. Marlene Brown was shot but survived her wounds. Several others present were injured in the attack. When Laban and his accomplices finally fled the scene, they left behind a massacre. The police investigation moved quickly by Jamaican standards. Dennis Laban was identified, located, and arrested within days. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Survivors had seen his face. They knew who he was. This was not a mystery that required the years of detective work to solve. At trial, Laban was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Jamaica still had capital punishment on the books, though executions had become increasingly rare by the late 1980s. Laban's death sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment. He remained behind bars until his death in 2010. He never showed remorse for killing the man who had tried to help him rebuild his life. The murder of Peter Tosh devastated the reggae community and raised troubling questions about the price of fame in Jamaica. Tosh had security. He had resources. He had survived an earlier attack in 1978 when he was severely beaten by police officers at a concert. He was a man who understood danger and had lived with it for years. But no amount of security can protect you from someone you have let inside your circle. Laban was not a stranger trying to breach the perimeter. He was a familiar face. Someone Tosh had known, someone Tosh had helped. The generosity that defined part of Tosh's character became the opening through which his killer walked. This case forces us to confront the terrible mathematics of trust. Peter Tosh tried to help a man from his past. He extended a hand to someone who had fallen, and that hand was bitten off. Do you believe artists in dangerous environments have any obligation to help people from their old neighborhoods and their former lives? Or does that obligation end when it threatens their survival? Is it possible to be successful in a place like Jamaica without becoming a target for the very people who watched you rise? I want to hear your thoughts on the impossible burden of fame in the comments below. If this devastating story of a legend killed by someone he trusted left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video with anyone who loves reggae music, and make sure you are subscribed for our fourth case, where we travel from Jamaica to Queens, New York, where the murder of a hip-hop pioneer would remain unsolved for nearly 2 decades, until investigators finally revealed that the killers had been hiding in plain sight all along. Number 4. Jam Master Jay. In the Merrick Boulevard recording studio in Queens, New York, there hung the presence of a man who had helped build hip-hop from the ground up. His name was Jason Mizell, though the world knew him as Jam Master Jay. He was the DJ of Run DMC, the group that had transformed rap music from a regional phenomenon into a global cultural force. Before Run DMC, hip-hop was something that happened in parks and clubs in New York City. After Run DMC, it was something that happened everywhere. Jam Master Jay was the heartbeat of that revolution. While Joseph Simmons and Daryl McDaniels handled the vocals, Jay provided the sonic foundation. His scratching and mixing techniques influenced an entire generation of DJs who came after him. The group's collaboration with Aerosmith on Walk This Way in 1986 broke down barriers between rock and rap that many believed could never be breached. It was a moment that changed the entire trajectory of popular music, and Jay was there at the turntables, making it happen. By 2002, the peak years of Run DMC were behind them. The group had not released a studio album in nearly a decade. But Jam Master Jay had not retired from music. He had reinvented himself as a mentor and producer, working with young artists at his Queens recording studio. He was helping to launch the next generation of hip-hop talent. He had discovered and signed a young rapper from Detroit named Eminem before Eminem became one of the biggest stars in the world. Even in his 40s, Jay remained connected to the future of the genre he had helped create. On the evening of October 30th, 2002, Jam Master Jay was at his 24/7 studio in Jamaica, Queens. It was a small, cluttered space where he spent most of his working hours. Several people were present that night, including his assistant and a few associates. The atmosphere was casual. Jay was doing what he always did, working on music. At approximately 7:30 p.m., two men entered the studio. Witnesses would later describe them as calm, purposeful, and focused. One of the men walked directly to where Jay was sitting. Without a word of warning, without any apparent negotiation or confrontation, the gunman raised a .40 caliber handgun and shot Jam Master Jay once in the head at point-blank range. Jay collapsed immediately. The wound was instantly fatal. One of the greatest DJs in hip-hop history died in his own studio, surrounded by the equipment he had used to change music forever. He was 37 years old. The gunman and his accomplice left the studio as calmly as they had entered. They did not take money. They did not steal equipment. This was not a robbery. It was an execution. The murder of Jam Master Jay shocked the hip-hop community and the wider world. Here was a pioneer, a man who had helped build an entire culture, gunned down in his workplace. The killing made headlines across the country. Everyone expected a quick arrest. Everyone expected justice. But justice did not come quickly. Days passed, then weeks, then months, then years. The investigation seemed to stall almost immediately. Witnesses who had been present that night became uncooperative. Rumors circulated about drug connections and industry conflicts, but no charges were filed. The case went cold. For 18 years, the murder of Jam Master Jay remained officially unsolved. It became one of the most notorious cold cases in hip-hop history. Mentioned in the same breath as the unsolved killings of Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G., conspiracy theories multiplied. Some blamed industry rivalries. Some blamed drug dealers. Some believed the truth would never emerge. Then, in August 2020, federal prosecutors announced that they had finally identified the killers. Two men were charged with the murder of Jam Master Jay. Their names were Carl Jordan Jr. and Ronald Washington. And when the details emerged, they revealed a betrayal that cut deeper than any stranger's bullet ever could. Carl Jordan Jr. was not a stranger to Jam Master Jay. He was a protege. Jay had mentored him, helped him navigate the music industry, invested time and energy in his development. Jordan was someone Jay had trusted, someone Jay had tried to help build a career. The relationship between them should have been defined by gratitude and loyalty. Instead, according to prosecutors, it was defined by a cocaine deal gone wrong. The investigation revealed that Jay had become involved in a narcotics transaction, arranging to purchase a substantial quantity of cocaine. Jordan and Washington were involved in that deal. When Jay allegedly cut them out of their share of the proceeds, they decided to collect their debt in blood. The trial took place in early 2024, more than 2 decades after the murder. The prosecution presented evidence that Jordan had been the gunman who fired the fatal shot. Witnesses testified. Financial records were examined. The case that had seemed unsolvable for 18 years finally had its day in court. Both Carl Jordan Jr. and Ronald Washington were convicted of murder in February 2024. The verdicts brought a measure of closure to a case that had haunted the hip-hop community for over 2 decades. But they also confirmed the worst fears of everyone who had followed the investigation. The killers were not strangers who had targeted a celebrity. They were people from Jay's own circle, people he had trusted, people he had tried to help. This case is devastating because of what it reveals about the vulnerability of mentorship. Jam Master Jay was not killed for his fame. He was not killed for his jewelry or his money. He was killed by someone he had invested in, someone he had tried to lift up. The very generosity that defined his post-run DMC years became the connection through which his murderer approached. Do you believe the music industry creates these dangerous relationships by mixing legitimate careers with underground economies? Is it possible to be a mentor in hip-hop without eventually encountering someone willing to kill for money? I want to hear your thoughts on whether the case's resolution brought true justice in the comments below. If this chilling story of a cold case finally cracked left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video to ensure Jam Master Jay's legacy is never forgotten. And make sure you are subscribed for our 5th case, where we travel from Queens to the Chelsea Hotel in Manhattan to examine the most debated death in punk rock history. A tragedy that still divides investigators and fans nearly 5 decades later. Number 5. Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen. In room 100 of the Chelsea Hotel in Manhattan, there exists a ghost story that punk rock has never been able to lay to rest. The Chelsea was a legendary residence for artists, musicians, and poets throughout the 20th century. Bob Dylan had written songs within its walls. Leonard Cohen had found inspiration in its corridors. It was a place where creativity and chaos intermingled freely, where the boundaries between genius and destruction grew impossibly thin. And on the morning of October 12th, 1978, it became the scene of a death that would haunt music history forever. The victim was a young woman named Nancy Spungen. She was 20 years old. She had been stabbed once in the abdomen with a hunting knife. The wound had severed her abdominal aorta. She had bled to death on the bathroom floor of room 100, while the man she loved was passed out in a heroin stupor on the bed in the next room. That man was Sid Vicious. He was the bass player for the Sex Pistols, the most infamous punk band in history. He was 21 years old. He was a heroin addict, and when the police arrived, he reportedly told them something that would follow him to his own grave. "I did it because I'm a dirty dog." To understand the tragedy of Sid and Nancy, you must first understand how deeply unqualified Sid Vicious was for the life he was living. He was born John Simon Ritchie in London in 1957. He had no musical training. He could barely play the bass guitar when he was recruited to join the Sex Pistols in 1977. The band's manager, Malcolm McLaren, chose him primarily for his look and his attitude. Sid had the sneer, the cheekbones, and the willingness to be shocking that punk rock demanded. Whether he could actually play his instrument was almost irrelevant. The Sex Pistols were never meant to last. They were a cultural explosion, a middle finger raised at the British establishment, a band that existed to destroy and provoke. Their album, Never Mind the Bollocks, remains one of the most influential records in rock history. But by the time Sid joined, the band was already beginning to implode. Internal conflicts, drug abuse, and the sheer impossibility of sustaining that level of chaos were tearing them apart. Nancy Spungen entered Sid's life in 1977. She was an American from Philadelphia who had traveled to London specifically to immerse herself in the punk scene. She was troubled long before she met Sid. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia as a child. She had been expelled from multiple schools. She had worked as a stripper and was already using heroin heavily when she attached herself to the Sex Pistols' orbit. Nancy initially pursued Johnny Rotten, the band's lead singer. When Rotten rejected her advances, she turned her attention to Sid. The connection between them was immediate and consuming. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Within months, they were both spiraling into heroin addiction so severe that it alarmed even their punk rock peers. The relationship between Sid and Nancy became legendary for its toxicity. They fought violently and publicly. They enabled each other's worst impulses. They alienated everyone around them. Nancy became Sid's manager of sorts, booking gigs and handling money, even as both of them descended deeper into addiction. Friends described them as mutually destructive, two people who brought out the absolute worst in each other. By October 1978, the Sex Pistols had already dissolved. Their American tour earlier that year had ended in disaster, with Johnny Rotten announcing on stage in San Francisco that the band was finished. Sid was attempting to launch a solo career, performing covers and original material at clubs in New York City. He and Nancy were living together at the Chelsea Hotel, funded by dwindling resources and sustained by constant heroin use. The night of October 11th, 1978, was chaotic even by their standards. Multiple people came and went from room 100 throughout the evening. Drugs were consumed. A heated argument erupted between Sid and Nancy at some point during the night. The details of what happened in those dark hours remain disputed to this day. What is certain is that Nancy Spungen was found dead the following morning. She was lying beneath the bathroom sink in a pool of blood. The murder weapon was a Jaguar-branded hunting knife that Sid had purchased just days earlier. He had reportedly been fascinated by the blade. It was found under the bed in the main room. Sid Vicious was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. His initial statements to police were confused and contradictory. He was deep in heroin withdrawal when questioned. He seemed genuinely uncertain about what had happened. At various points, he claimed he had killed Nancy. At other points, he said he had no memory of the events. The confession he offered was unreliable at best. The rambling statement of a man whose brain had been devastated by years of drug abuse. The case never went to trial. On February 2nd, 1979, less than 4 months after Nancy's death, Sid Vicious was found dead in his girlfriend's apartment in Greenwich Village. He had overdosed on heroin. The fatal dose had reportedly been provided by his mother, Anne Beverly, who had flown from London to be with her son during his legal troubles. Whether she knew the heroin was unusually pure or whether Sid intentionally took a lethal amount remains unknown. Sid Vicious died at 21 years old. He was never convicted of Nancy Spungen's murder. The case was officially closed with his death. The truth of what happened in room 100 died with him. But questions have persisted for nearly 5 decades. Was Sid Vicious actually capable of murder? The physical evidence was ambiguous. Some investigators believed the single stab wound was inconsistent with the frenzied attack typically seen in domestic violence cases. Others noted that Sid was so impaired by drugs that coordinated violence seemed unlikely. Alternative theories have circulated since 1978. Several people were present in or around room 100 that night. Drug dealers had reportedly visited the room. Some investigators theorized that Nancy was killed during a robbery gone wrong, possibly by someone seeking drugs or money. Sid would have been too incapacitated to intervene or even to remember what he witnessed. Rocket's Red Glare, an actor and comedian who had visited the room that night to deliver drugs, was suspected by some investigators. He died in 2001 without ever being charged. Other names have been mentioned over the years. None of the alternative theories have ever been proven. This case remains one of the most tragic and unresolved mysteries in rock history. 2 young people, both deeply damaged before they ever met, found each other and accelerated toward destruction. Whether Sid killed Nancy in a moment of drug-fueled violence, or whether someone else took her life while Sid lay unconscious, the outcome was the same. Both were dead within 4 months of each other. Both were in their early 20s. Both left behind nothing but questions. Do you believe Sid Vicious was capable of murdering the only person he ever seemed to love? Or was he too destroyed by addiction to remember what happened that night? Is it possible that the real killer walked away while Sid took the blame? I want to hear your thoughts on this impossible mystery in the comments below. If this haunting story of punk's most tragic couple left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video with anyone who follows rock history, and make sure you are subscribed for our 6th case, where we flip the script entirely. In Sweden, a black metal musician did not become a victim. He became a murderer, proving that sometimes the monster is not hiding in the band. Sometimes the monster is the band. Number 6. Nödtveidt. In the Gothic spires and rain-slicked streets of Gothenburg, Sweden, there emerged in the early 1990s a band that would become one of the most influential forces in extreme metal. They called themselves Dissection. Their sound blended the ferocity of death metal with the atmospheric darkness of black metal. Their guitarist and vocalist was a young man named John Nödtveidt. He was considered a prodigy, a musician whose technical skill and compositional vision placed him at the forefront of the Swedish metal scene. Dissection's second album, Storm of the Light's Bane, released in 1995, is still regarded as a masterpiece of the genre. The songs were intricate, brutal, and strangely beautiful. Critics praised the album's ambition, Fans embraced its darkness. Nödtveidt was positioned to become one of the great figures in heavy metal history. He had talent. He had vision. He had a future that seemed limitless. But Nödtveidt was not merely performing darkness. He was practicing it. Unlike many metal musicians who treat satanic imagery as theatrical provocation, Nödtveidt was a genuine adherent of an ideology called theistic Satanism. He believed that Satan was a real entity worthy of worship. He belonged to an organization called the Misanthropic Luciferian Order, later known as the Temple of the Black Light. This was not performance. This was faith. The ideology that Nödtveidt embraced was called anti-cosmic Satanism. Its followers believed that the material world was a prison created by a false god. They believed that chaos and destruction were sacred acts that helped dismantle this cosmic prison. They believed that certain acts of violence could serve as offerings to the dark forces they worshipped. It was a belief system designed to justify the unjustifiable. In July 1997, Nödtveidt put his beliefs into action. Along with an accomplice named Vlad, he encountered a 37-year-old Algerian immigrant named Joseph Ben Medour in a park in Gothenburg. What happened next was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was a targeted killing. Joseph Ben Medour was gay, according to testimony that emerged during the subsequent trial. This was the primary reason he was selected as a victim. Nödtveidt and his accomplice viewed homosexuality as deserving of punishment. They approached Medour in the park. They attacked him, and then Nödtveidt shot him with a taser before finishing him with a firearm. The killing was presented to authorities as a robbery gone wrong. But the evidence revealed something far more sinister. The murder of Joseph Ben Medour was a hate crime. It was an execution carried out by a man who believed his ideology gave him permission to take human life. The robbery narrative was a cover story designed to obscure the true motivation. Investigators saw through the deception quickly. Nödtveidt was arrested, tried, and convicted of accessory to murder. Swedish courts sentenced him to 10 years in prison. His accomplice received 8 years for a crime that was clearly premeditated, driven by hatred, and executed without mercy. The sentences struck many observers as inadequate. But Swedish sentencing guidelines were designed for rehabilitation rather than punishment. Nödtveidt would serve his time and eventually walk free. He was released from prison in 2004. Almost immediately, he announced that Dissection would reform. The band recorded one final album, Reinkaus, released in 2006. The album was explicitly designed as a musical expression of the anti-cosmic satanic ideology that Nödtveidt had embraced. Every song was crafted to serve as an invocation. Every lyric was written as an offering to the dark forces he worshipped. But Nödtveidt was not planning a long career after his return. In his ideology, suicide was not an act of despair. It was the final sacrament. The Temple of the Black Light taught that taking one's own life was the ultimate act of liberation from the material prison. It was how a true believer returned to the chaos from which all souls originated. On August 13, 2006, Nödtveidt was found dead in his apartment in Hässelby, Sweden. He had shot himself in the head while sitting inside a circle of lit candles. He was surrounded by the texts and symbols of his religious order. He was 31 years old. He left behind a body of influential music and a legacy permanently stained by murder. The death of Nödtveidt was not a tragedy in the conventional sense. He did not die as a victim. He died as a killer who had escaped justice through the leniency of the Swedish prison system. He died as a man who had taken an innocent life because his victim was gay, and therefore deemed unworthy of existence. The ritual circumstances of his suicide only underscored how completely he had surrendered to an ideology of hatred and destruction. This case forces us to confront the darkest possible relationship between art and belief. Nödtveidt created music that continues to be celebrated in extreme metal circles. Storm of the Light's Bane is still praised as a landmark album, but the man who created it was also a murderer who killed because of hatred and justified that murder through religious conviction. Do you believe it is possible to separate the art from the artist when the artist is a convicted killer? Can you listen to Dissection knowing that the man behind the music took an innocent life? Or does the murder of Joseph Ben Medour render everything Nödtveidt created morally contaminated. I want to hear your thoughts on the price of genius in the comments below. If this disturbing story of a musician who became a monster left you stunned, please hit the like button, share this video with anyone who follows extreme metal, and make sure you are subscribed for our 7th case, where we travel to modern-day Atlanta to witness a clash between rap crews that proves this pattern of violence continues today. In the age of streaming and social media and viral beefs. Number 7. King Von. In the parking lot of a hookah lounge in Atlanta, Georgia, on a warm November night in 2020, two worlds collided with lethal consequences. The city had become the capital of American hip-hop, a place where careers were launched and rivalries were settled. On this particular evening, the collision involved two rising stars whose online beef had been escalating for months. By the time the sun rose, one of them would be dead, and the other's associate would face murder charges. The victim was Davon Bennett, known to millions of fans as King Von. He was 26 years old. He was a Chicago drill rapper who had emerged from the notorious O-Block housing project on the South Side. His music was autobiographical in the most literal sense. He rapped about shootings he had witnessed and participated in. He rapped about friends who had been killed and enemies he had allegedly killed himself. His storytelling ability was remarkable. His authenticity was undeniable, and his past was violent in ways that extended far beyond lyrics. Before becoming a rapper, King Von had been arrested multiple times. He had faced murder charges in connection with a 2014 killing, though those charges were eventually dropped. He had been shot himself. He had lost close friends to gun violence. His music was not fantasy. It was documentation of a life lived on the razor's edge between survival and death. King Von's mentor was Lil Durk, another Chicago rapper who had achieved mainstream success. Durk had signed Von to his record label and helped guide his career. Under Durk's guidance, Von had released music that resonated with millions. His song Crazy Story had become a viral hit, a detailed narrative of street violence that showcased his storytelling gifts. He was on the verge of genuine stardom, but King Von had enemies. One of them was a rapper from Savannah, Georgia, named Quando Rondo. The beef between them had been simmering for months on social media. Diss tracks had been released. Insults had been exchanged. The conflict was typical of the hip-hop world, where rivalries are often performed publicly for audience engagement. Most of these beefs never escalate beyond words. On November 6, 2020, both King Von and Quando Rondo happened to be in Atlanta at the same time. Whether this was coincidence or coordination remains disputed. What is certain is that around 3:20 a.m., both crews ended up at the same location, the Monaco Hookah Lounge on Trinity Avenue. The confrontation began in the parking lot. Security cameras captured what happened next. King Von approached Quando Rondo directly. Words were exchanged. And then King Von threw the first punch, initiating a physical altercation that quickly spiraled out of control. Within seconds, the parking lot erupted into chaos. Members of both crews joined the fight. Punches were thrown, bodies fell to the ground. And then the gunfire began. Timothy Leaks, known by his street name Lul Tim, was a member of Quando Rondo's entourage. When he saw his friend being attacked by King Von and others, he drew a firearm. He fired multiple shots. At least one of those shots struck King Von. The scene was pandemonium. Police officers who were working security nearby heard the gunfire and responded. An officer discharged his weapon as well, striking Leaks. Both King Von and Lul Tim were transported to hospitals. Leaks survived his wounds. King Von did not. Davon Bennett, King Von, was pronounced dead at Grady Memorial Hospital on November 6, 2020. He was 26 years old. He had been shot multiple times during the confrontation. His death sent shockwaves through the hip-hop community. Tributes poured in from artists across the country. His fans mourned a talent that would never reach its full potential. Timothy Leaks was charged with murder. The case proceeded slowly through the Georgia court system. His defense argued that Leaks had acted in defense of Quando Rondo, who was being attacked by Von and his crew. The surveillance footage showed Von throwing the first punch. The defense contended that Leaks had no choice but to use lethal force to protect himself and his friends. In 2024, Timothy Leaks was acquitted of all charges. The jury apparently accepted the self-defense argument. The man who had fired the shots that killed King Von walked out of the courthouse a free man. The verdict was controversial. Von's family and fans were devastated. But under Georgia law, the use of deadly force to prevent serious bodily harm to oneself or others can be legally justified. This case illustrates the deadly consequences of hip-hop's culture of public rivalry. King Von and Quando Rondo had been trading insults online for months. Their fans had been encouraging the conflict, treating it as entertainment. Neither artist seemed to consider that words could lead to bullets, that a parking lot confrontation could end in death. The surveillance footage tells a damning story. King Von was the aggressor. He threw the first punch. He initiated the physical violence that led to his own death. Whatever grievances he had against Quando Rondo, he chose to settle them with his fists in a parking lot at 3 a.m. And that choice cost him everything. Do you believe the acquittal was just? If King Von initiated the violence, does Lil Tim bear moral responsibility for escalating to lethal force? Or was he simply protecting his friend from an attack? Where is the line between self-defense and murder, when both sides are armed and ready for violence? I want to hear your thoughts on this modern tragedy in the comments below. If this story of a rivalry turned fatal left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video with anyone who follows hip-hop culture. And make sure you are subscribed for our 8th case, where we travel to Corpus Christi, Texas, to witness the murder of the most beloved Tejano star in history. Killed not by a stranger, but by the president of her own fan club. Number 8. Selena Quintanilla. In the coastal city of Corpus Christi, Texas, there lived a young woman whose voice had the power to unite cultures and transcend borders. Her name was Selena Quintanilla Perez, though her millions of fans around the world knew her simply as Selena. She was the undisputed queen of Tejano music, a genre that blended traditional Mexican sounds with American pop and cumbia rhythms. At just 23 years old, she had already achieved more than most artists accomplish in a lifetime. She had won a Grammy. She had sold out arenas across the Americas. She was on the verge of crossing over into mainstream English-language pop stardom. But Selena's greatest gift was also her greatest vulnerability. She trusted people. She believed in loyalty. She welcomed fans and associates into her inner circle with a warmth that was genuine and unguarded. And on March 31st, 1995, that trust was shattered by a single bullet fired by the woman she had treated like family. To understand the murder of Selena, you must first understand the killer. Her name was Yolanda Saldivar. She was a former nurse from San Antonio who had founded the Selena fan club in 1991. By all accounts, Saldivar was obsessed with the young singer from the moment they met. She worked tirelessly to build the fan club into an organization with thousands of members. She volunteered countless hours. She seemed devoted to Selena's success in a way that went far beyond professional obligation. Selena's father, Abraham Quintanilla, was initially suspicious of Saldivar. Something about her intensity made him uncomfortable. But Selena saw only a dedicated supporter, someone who believed in her music and wanted to help spread her message. Against her father's reservations, Selena brought Saldivar deeper into her world. In 1994, Selena opened a pair of boutiques called Selena Etc., selling clothing and jewelry designed by the singer herself. She appointed Yolanda Saldivar to manage these businesses. It was a position of enormous trust. Saldivar had access to money, to inventory, to confidential business information. She was no longer just a fan club president. She was an employee handling significant financial responsibilities. But Saldivar was not worthy of that trust. Over the course of 1994, irregularities began to surface. Money was missing from the boutiques. Fan club members complained that they had paid dues but never received their promised merchandise. Financial records did not add up. When Abraham Quintanilla investigated, he discovered that Saldivar had been embezzling funds for months. The total amount stolen was estimated at over $30,000. In early 1995, Selena confronted Saldivar about the missing money. Rather than admit her crimes, Saldivar began a campaign of manipulation and delay. She claimed to have been the victim of a rape. She claimed to have documentation that would prove her innocence. She kept Selena engaged in a web of excuses and emotional manipulation while the investigation continued. On the morning of March 31st, 1995, Selena went to the Days Inn motel in Corpus Christi, where Saldivar had been staying. She was there to retrieve financial documents that Saldivar had claimed to possess. Selena went alone. She did not bring security. She still believed that the situation could be resolved through conversation. What happened inside that motel room has been reconstructed from forensic evidence and Saldivar's own contradictory statements. At some point during their conversation, Saldivar pulled out a .38 caliber revolver. She pointed it at the young woman who had given her everything, and she fired. The bullet struck Selena in the right shoulder. It severed a major artery. Selena turned and ran from the room, bleeding catastrophically. She made it to the motel lobby, where she collapsed on the floor. She managed to name her attacker before losing consciousness. "Yolanda Saldivar," she gasped. In room 158, paramedics rushed Selena to Corpus Christi Memorial Hospital. Doctors performed emergency surgery, but the damage was too severe. At 1:05 p.m. on March 31st, 1995, Selena Quintanilla Perez was pronounced dead. She was 23 years old. She had been scheduled to record her first major English-language album just weeks later. Yolanda Saldivar did not flee the scene. After shooting Selena, she got into her pickup truck in the motel parking lot and began a 9-hour standoff with police. She held the revolver to her own head, threatening suicide, while negotiators tried to talk her down. Television crews broadcast the standoff live. The entire city watched as the woman who had killed their beloved Selena sat in that truck, surrounded by police, seemingly unable to face the consequences of what she had done. Eventually, Saldivar surrendered. She was arrested, charged with first-degree murder, and held without bail. Her trial became one of the most watched legal proceedings in Texas history. The courtroom was packed every day. Fans gathered outside, many of them weeping openly. Saldivar's defense argued that the shooting was accidental. They claimed the gun had discharged while Saldivar was attempting suicide. That Selena had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The prosecution demolished this argument with forensic evidence. The trajectory of the bullet, the distance between shooter and victim, the lack of any powder burns on Selena's body, all pointed to a deliberate shot fired from several feet away. On October 23, 1995, Yolanda Saldivar was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. As of today, she remains incarcerated in a Texas prison. Her first parole hearing took place in March 2025. It was denied. Selena's family and fans have vowed to oppose her release at every future hearing. The murder of Selena devastated the Tejano music community and transcended into mainstream American consciousness. Over 60,000 mourners visited her casket during the public viewing. Her posthumous album, Dreaming of You, debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, making her the first predominantly Spanish-language artist to achieve that milestone. She became a symbol of Latino pride, of dreams cut short, of talent silenced by senseless violence. This case forces us to confront the danger of obsessive devotion. Yolanda Saldivar did not hate Selena. By all accounts, she worshipped her. But that worship curdled into something possessive and ultimately murderous when Saldivar's crimes were about to be exposed. She killed Selena not out of hatred, but out of desperation. She would rather destroy the object of her obsession than face the consequences of betraying her. Do you believe obsessive fans pose a unique danger to artists who welcome them into their inner circles? Should celebrities maintain stricter boundaries with their most devoted followers? Or was Selena simply unlucky enough to encounter a disturbed individual who would have found a way to get close to her regardless? I want to hear your thoughts on the terrible price of fame in the comments below. If this heartbreaking story of a legend killed by someone who claimed to love her left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video with anyone who cherishes Selena's memory. And make sure you are subscribed for our 9th case, where we travel to Los Angeles to witness the murder of a rapper whose commitment to his community became the very thing that destroyed him. Number 9. Nipsey Hussle. In the Crenshaw district of South Los Angeles, there stood a strip mall that had become sacred ground for an entire community. It was called the Marathon Clothing Store, and it was owned by one of the most respected figures in modern hip-hop. His name was Euronymous, though the world knew him as Nipsey Hussle. He was more than a rapper. He was a businessman, an activist, and a symbol of what was possible when someone from the streets decided to invest in their own neighborhood rather than abandon it. Nipsey Hussle grew up in the Crenshaw district, surrounded by gang violence and poverty. He was a member of the Rollins 60s Crips, a reality he never denied or glamorized. But unlike many who emerged from that environment, Nipsey chose a different path. He built businesses. He purchased property in his old neighborhood. He created jobs for people who had no other options. He became a beacon of hope in a community that had seen too many of its brightest lights extinguished. His music reflected his journey. Albums like Victory Lap, which earned him a Grammy nomination in 2019, told stories of struggle and redemption. He rapped about gang life, not to glorify it, but to document it, to show young people that there was another way. He collaborated with everyone from Kendrick Lamar to Snoop Dogg. He was respected across all corners of the hip-hop world, but Nipsey's commitment to his community meant that he never left it. He could have moved to a gated mansion in the hills. He could have surrounded himself with security and distanced himself from the streets that raised him. Instead, he remained in Crenshaw. He walked the same blocks he had walked as a teenager. He was accessible to his neighbors, to his fans, to anyone who wanted to talk. That accessibility would cost him his life. On the afternoon of March 31st, 2019, Nipsey Hussle was standing in the parking lot of his Marathon Clothing Store. He was talking with friends, conducting business, doing the same things he did every day. He was not performing at a concert or attending a high-profile event. He was simply existing in his own neighborhood, among his own people. A man named Eric Holder approached the group. Holder was not a stranger. He was from the same neighborhood. He was a member of the same gang. He and Nipsey had known each other for years. But earlier that day, Nipsey had confronted Holder about rumors that Holder had been cooperating with law enforcement. The ultimate betrayal in gang culture. The conversation had been tense, but not violent. Nipsey had told Holder to clear his name, to prove the rumors were false. Then Nipsey had moved on with his day. Eric Holder did not move on. He left the parking lot, but he did not leave the area. He went to acquire a weapon, and then he returned. At approximately 3:25 p.m., Eric Holder walked back into the Marathon Clothing parking lot. He approached Nipsey Hussle from behind. Without warning, he drew a semi-automatic handgun and began firing. He shot Nipsey multiple times in the head and torso. Then, as Nipsey lay on the ground, Holder stood over him and kicked him in the head. It was a final act of contempt, a statement that this was personal. Holder fled the scene in a waiting getaway car driven by a woman he had been with that day. He was captured on security cameras. His identity was never in doubt. The Los Angeles Police Department issued a citywide manhunt. 2 days later, Eric Holder was arrested in Bellflower, California. He was charged with first-degree murder. Nipsey Hussle was rushed to a nearby hospital, but his wounds were catastrophic. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. He was 33 years old. He left behind 2 children and a partner, actress Lauren London. He left behind a clothing store, a record label, and dozens of community programs he had founded or funded. He left behind a neighborhood that would never be the same. The reaction to Nipsey's death was unprecedented. Celebrities, politicians, and athletes issued statements of mourning. Former President Barack Obama wrote a personal letter praising Nipsey's work. His memorial service was held at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, attended by over 21,000 people. The procession route through South Los Angeles stretched for 25 miles. It was the largest public funeral the city had seen since the death of Michael Jackson a decade earlier. Eric Holder's trial took place in 2022. His defense argued that the killing was a spontaneous act of passion, provoked by Nipsey's earlier confrontation about the snitching rumors. The prosecution argued that Holder had left the scene, acquired a weapon, and returned specifically to kill, which constituted premeditation. The jury sided with the prosecution. Eric Holder was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 60 years to life in prison. This case devastates because of its senselessness. Nipsey Hussle was killed by someone from his own community, someone who should have been proud to have such a figure in their midst. He was killed over words exchanged in a parking lot, over rumors and wounded pride. He was killed because he refused to abandon the neighborhood that raised him, because he remained accessible when he could have hidden behind gates and guards. Do you believe Nipsey's commitment to staying in his community was heroic or reckless? Should successful artists from dangerous neighborhoods distance themselves for their own safety? Or does that abandonment perpetuate the very problems they escaped? I want to hear your thoughts on the price of loyalty in the comments below. If this devastating story of a community hero killed by his own people left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video with anyone who believes in Nipsey's marathon. And make sure you are subscribed for our final case, where we step back from these individual tragedies to examine the pattern that connects them all. Number 10. The pattern. We have now walked through 9 graveyards scattered across the geography of modern music. We have stood in the frozen forests of Norway, where black metal became a blood sport. We have entered a Manhattan high-rise where a creative partnership ended with a bullet to the neck. We have visited the hills above Kingston where a reggae legend was killed by a man he tried to help. We have lingered in a Queens recording studio where a hip-hop pioneer was executed by people he had mentored. We have descended into the chaos of the Chelsea Hotel, where punk's most tragic couple met their ends. We have confronted the evil of a Swedish musician who killed because his ideology demanded blood. We have witnessed a parking lot confrontation in Atlanta that proved violence continues in the streaming age. We have mourned a Tejano queen killed by her own fan club president, and we have grieved for a community hero shot down in his own neighborhood. These stories span 5 decades. They cross genres from reggae to metal to punk to hip-hop to Tejano. They occur in Jamaica and Norway and New York and Sweden and Texas and Los Angeles. The victims were men and women. They were famous and rising. They were aggressive and gentle. They were warned and they were ambushed without notice. But one thread connects every single case we have examined. The killers were not strangers. They were bandmates. They were spouses. They were protégés. They were employees. They were neighbors. They were people who had shared stages and studios and meals and secrets. They were people who knew the schedules and the door codes and the vulnerabilities. They were the inner circle turned firing squad. This pattern forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the music industry. Fame does not provide protection. It provides proximity. The more successful an artist becomes, the more people enter their orbit. Managers and producers and assistants and security guards and old friends from the neighborhood and new friends who appear after the hit singles. Each of these relationships is a potential vulnerability. Each of these people has access that a stranger never could. Peter Tosh tried to help Dennis Laban rebuild his life after prison. That generosity was repaid with a bullet to the head. Jam Master Jay mentored Carl Jordan Jr., invested time and energy in his development. That mentorship was repaid with an execution in his own studio. Selena gave Yolanda Saldivar access to her businesses, her trust, her life. That trust was repaid with a gunshot in a motel room. Nipsey Hussle stayed in his neighborhood when he could have fled to safety. That loyalty was repaid with bullets in his own parking lot. The mathematics of trust are devastating. The more you help people, the more access you give them. The more access you give them, the more vulnerable you become. Every favor creates an expectation. Every act of generosity can curdle into entitlement in the wrong mind. When an artist succeeds, there will always be people who believe they deserve a larger share. And some of those people are willing to kill for what they believe they are owed. What can be done? The honest answer is very little. Musicians cannot simply refuse to trust anyone. They cannot operate without managers and producers and touring personnel. They cannot succeed in isolation. The very collaboration that creates great music also creates the conditions for betrayal. Perhaps the only protection is awareness. Perhaps musicians who understand this pattern can be more careful about who they allow into their inner circles. Perhaps they can recognize the warning signs of entitlement and resentment before those feelings metastasize into violence. Perhaps they can maintain boundaries that keep them safe, without sacrificing the creative intimacy that makes great art possible. But probably not. The artists we have examined were not naive. Peter Tosh was a step-in raiser who understood violence intimately. King Von had survived shootings and murder charges before his death. Nipsey Hussle grew up in gang territory and knew exactly how dangerous his environment remained. They knew the risks. They took precautions, and they died anyway, killed by people who had found their way inside the walls. This investigation has been difficult to conduct. Every case involved real people with real families who continue to mourn. Euronymous was someone's son. Nancy Spungen was someone's daughter. Selena was someone's sister and someone's wife. Nipsey was a father who will never see his children grow up. These are not just stories. These are wounds that have never fully healed. But we tell these stories because silence serves the killers. When we forget the victims, we allow their deaths to mean nothing. When we remember them, we honor their contributions and acknowledge the price they paid for making music in a dangerous world. Jam Master Jay's turntables changed the course of hip-hop history. Peter Tosh's voice gave courage to movements for equal rights around the world. Selena's songs continue to unite Latino communities decades after her death. Nipsey Hussle's investments are still creating jobs in Crenshaw today. They deserve to be remembered for what they created, not just for how they died. If this investigation opened your eyes to the dangers that lurk within the music industry, please hit the like button. Share this video with every music fan you know. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications to join our community of investigators. We have a massive new investigation starting next week that digs into the dark secrets of managers who destroyed the artists they were supposed to protect. The music never dies, but the musicians do. And sometimes, the killer is standing right beside them on stage, waiting for the encore to end.